He was commissioned in the regular army in 1976 after 1 year at the Virginia Military Institute and 4 years at West Point. In 2004, Macgregor retired with the rank of colonel. In 2020, the president appointed Macgregor to serve as a senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense. He holds an MA in comparative politics and a PhD in international relations from the University of Virginia. Macgregor is widely known inside the U.S., Europe, Israel, Russia, China, and Korea for both his leadership in the Battle of 73 Easting, the U.S. Army's largest tank battle in World War II, in which Colonel Macgregor commanded a tank and a unit of, I think, 19 tanks and about...
Actually, it was 1,100 men with 42 tanks, 42 Bradleys, and 8 guns.
I believe it was during a sandstorm in the middle of the night, too.
Well, it was in the sandstorm late in the afternoon, but the battle lasted for over 3 hours, and we did have 1 man killed, 6 wounded, and we lost a Bradley, an infantry fighting vehicle.
So he is a war fighter. He's written groundbreaking books on military transformation, one of them, Breaking the Phalanx, from 1997, and Transformation Under Fire in 2003. Macgregor's recommendations for change in force design and integrated all-arms effects operations have profoundly influenced force development in Israel, Russia, and China. In 2010, Colonel Macgregor traveled to Seoul, Korea, to advise the Republic of Korea in its defense force design. Transformation Under Fire was selected by Lieutenant Aviv Kovavi, of the chief of the Israeli Defense Forces, as the intellectual basis for the transformation of that military force. In 28 years of service, Macgregor taught in the Department of Social Sciences at West Point and commanded the 1st Squadron, 4th Cavalry, and served as director of joint operations at SHAPE during the Kosovo Air Campaign. In January 2002, at Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld's insistence, the U.S. CENTCOM commander listened to Colonel Macgregor's concept for the offensive to seize Baghdad. The plan was largely adopted according to his ideas, but he assumed no occupation of Iraq by U.S. forces. He's testified as an expert witness before the Senate House Armed Services Committee and appeared as a defense analyst on Fox News, BBC, Sky News, and many, many others. I wanted to read that, and that's only a small part of Colonel Macgregor's curriculum vitae. He's really, as I said, an intellectual commander of U.S. military strategy around the world, and extremely influential. So I wanted to talk to you, Colonel Macgregor, about specifically about the Ukraine war, and how would you summarize that war in terms of U.S. military strategy?
Well, I think, first of all,
this way, geopolitical strategy and military strategy, we'll take them both.
Well, I think we need to establish up front that there has never really been a strategy. That's part of our problem, and it's been a problem for us for decades. And by strategy, you usually mean that you have a clear, unambiguous, attainable political military objective. You have a way to achieve it. And at the end of that process, you have an end state in mind. In other words, you have some vision of what you would like things to look like when it's over. We tend to stumble into things and then muddle through as opposed to devising an effective strategy. And right now, Ukraine is a good example. We, as you know, and by the way, I want to take a minute here just to thank you for your pursuit of the truth, because today, when we talk about Ukraine, that's really what we want to get at more than anything else, is what's the truth? Because the truth has been very difficult to discover, and very few Americans have heard the truth. And it's not just Americans, it's most of us in the West. So if you look at the situation today, we have to go back probably into the first part of this century, at a series of discussions that Mr. Putin, when he became president, held with leaders in the West, trying to articulate to them his concerns about the expansion of the NATO alliance. And in 2008, despite these discussions, we made it clear that we didn't care, that we were going to advance the borders of NATO east to include Ukraine. And now keep in mind that Russia does already have a border with NATO. It's in Estonia. It's a small border just south of St. Petersburg. But the Russians view whatever happens in Ukraine as a potentially existential matter for them. And in 2014, we backed or staged or orchestrated a coup that put in power a very radical regime that was hostile to the interests of Moscow and to Russia. And as a result of this, Mr. Putin and his colleagues in the Kremlin were convinced that the United States Navy would very shortly end up docking in Crimea, in Sevastopol, and take over the naval facilities there. And that's one of the reasons that Putin struck quickly and seized control of Crimea, because he wasn't prepared to cede dominance in the Black Sea to the United States and NATO. Subsequently, the Ukrainians began attacking citizens inside their borders who were Russians. And almost a third of the population certainly is first and foremost Russian speaking, and probably 20 to 25% are frankly Russians living in the part of Ukraine where today the fighting is occurring. And these people were treated as second-class citizens. They were told to become Ukrainians, to abandon their heritage, their language, their culture, or they would be subject to harsh treatment, which of course many of them were. At the same time, there were two oblasts or provinces in the east, Luhansk and Donetsk, that indicated they wanted to retain their Russian culture. They would stay inside Ukraine, but they wanted to continue to live as Russians inside Ukraine. This was unacceptable to the new regime, and the new regime began shelling them. And in the space between the outbreak of the current war on 22 February last year and 2014, when this crisis first began, 14,000 people were killed in that area. And the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe has reported very clearly that all of this was started not by Russia, but by the new Ukrainian government. Now, over time, it became very clear that some solution had to be found to avoid expanding this war. And that is one of the reasons why the Minsk Accords were drafted. And they were simply drafted with the goal in mind of providing equal rights before the law for the Russians in eastern Ukraine and putting an end to the violence and the killing. This unfortunately never occurred. And now we know from the statements from Chancellor Merkel in December of last year and more recently from President Macron that these agreements were in fact a fraud, that these agreements were designed to simply buy time for Ukraine while we poured billions of dollars and extraordinarily good modern equipment and training into the Ukrainian armed forces, specifically the army.
Can I interrupt you, Colonel Macgregor?
Yes.
You can explain to the audience about who drafted the accord and who were signatories to it.
Well, it was France, Great Britain. I think it was Great Britain and Germany and Russia. And of course, we were not really signatories to it, but we were co-sponsors, if you will. We were backing it.
And the Ukrainian government
yes,
refused to ratify it. It was voted on, I believe, by the citizens of Donbass.